The Twits by Roald Dahl. The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again any time you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all about tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve onto his trousers.
"You're plotting something,"
Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she had taken out her glass eye.
"Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something."
Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day.
"You'd better be careful,"
Mrs. Twit said,
"because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat."
"Oh, do shut up, you old hag,"
Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump.
"I told you I was watching you,"
cackled Mrs. Twit.
"I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful."
The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed.
"What's the matter with you?"
Mr. Twit said.
"Help!"
screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about.
"There's something in my bed!"
"I'll bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now,"
Mr. Twit said.
"That what?"
screamed Mrs. Twit.
"I tried to kill it, but it got away,"
Mr. Twit said.
"It's got teeth like screwdrivers."
"Help!"
screamed Mrs. Twit.
"Save me! It's all over my feet!"
"It'll bite your toes off,"
said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again.
"By golly, it is a giant skillywiggler,"
Mr. Twit said.
"It'll bite your nose off."
Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show, because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese.
Hey, my spaghetti's moving,
cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork.
It's a new kind,
Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms.
It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot.
Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long, tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin.
It's not as good as the ordinary kind,
he said, talking with his mouth full.
It's too, squishy.
I find it very tasty,
Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms.
I find it rather bitter,
Mr. Twit said.
It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time.
Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said,
You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?
Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth.
Why?
He said.
And why it had a nasty, bitter taste?
Why?
He said.
Because it was worms,
cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter.